So whenever I'm like speaking to someone, especially if I want to act cool and laid back and stuff, I can't. I have to like kind of like lean. What are they saying to me?
Yeah, so if you're leaning forward, you're lip reading without realising. So you leant forward and like squinted, and that is lip reading, right? Because
Oh god.
and also it's extra hard in bars because there's background music, there's people talking.
Life today is chaotic, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. But within the chaos lies opportunity, and we're here to seize it. This is Generation Uncharted. Samantha Baines, how are you? Welcome to Generation Uncharted.
Thanks for having me. I'm good. I mean, we've both not slept very much because of our children, but you know, apart from that.
Haven't slept very much, and I'm so excited to have you on this podcast because for those that don't know, Sam and I do a podcast together called Bisexual Brunch. But this is the first time that I've poached you to come and be on Generation Uncharted. And it's a visual podcast as well, so we actually get to see each other this time, which is really nice.
Yeah, normally we're just voices in the void, but now we're voices with faces in the void.
I love that. I have talked to Ash about making Bisexual Brunch a visual podcast, but he won't have it, so that's fine. Anyway, I wanted to talk to you at first about disability. So I feel like we live in a time where lots of people talk about diversity and inclusion, yet there are still so many barriers that exist for disabled people. So I wanted to understand from you, what do you think society is still behind on when it comes to true accessibility?
Well, it's behind on true accessibility, full stop. I think, especially, as a deaf person, there's so many things and just in everyday life that have been designed without deaf people in mind and also without disabled people in mind. So the access just hasn't been put in right at the very beginning. And then we become used to that as a society of like, this is just the way things are done. And then when new things are put in place, for example, the train network, we're like, this is the way things have been done. And then someone designs a new carriage and they still don't take that into consideration. So things like, when I go to get the train and I'm trying to buy a ticket on the machine, if the machine's beeping because my card hasn't connected, for example, I can't hear the beeping. If the doors are beeping when the train closes, I can't hear that beeping. If there's train announcements, the platform's changed, I can't always hear all of that information. So I have hearing aids and I lip read and I'm deaf with a lowercase d. So deaf with a lowercase d is normally what everyone in the deaf community can call themselves. Deaf with an uppercase D, a capital D, is more for like deaf community, deaf culture and deaf pride. So it's normally something that people use if they were like born into a deaf family or deaf from birth and use British Sign Language as their first language. So I call myself deaf with a lowercase d. So I have some hearing. I mean, all deaf experience is different, but I still have some hearing and then obviously some loss, as is the medical term for it. So I can still hear some of the lower registers, but the higher registers are where I struggle. So if I have hearing aids help, but they help amplify the sound I already have. So hearing aids don't bring me up to full hearing. So hearing aids, wearing them doesn't mean that I can hear like you can hear. So, and I think that's a big misconception, right? So they're like, oh, you've got your hearing aids, so you'll be fine. No, I still can't hear all of announcements when I'm wearing my hearing aids. The doorbell, if I'm in a different room, that beeping that I talked about on the train, on machines. And I've spoken to deaf people who've been like on a bus and there's been a fire and no one's come to tell them that there's a fire because the driver just announces it from his seat, downstairs at the front, and they're sitting at the back like, what's going on? Obviously, if they see smoke, they move. But, if it's in the engine, you don't see it to begin with, and everyone's getting off the bus and they're like, what's going on? And people don't even turn around and go, hey, there's a fire, did you know? Get off the bus. They just do their own thing. So, it's also from a safety perspective, it's not put in place.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
That's terrible. Although I guess, being fair to people, probably people would not assume, because a lot of disabilities are invisible. Probably people assume everyone else heard it, run for your life. Well, actually, just coming back to something you said about the machines. So I was going to ask you, is it getting better with obviously there's so many disabilities, but is it getting better now because of the technology? You know, I saw that the Apple AirPods, for example, are going to be able to double as hearing aids soon, and there are more apps and things to help people get around. But obviously then I never even thought, like you were saying, about the machines and some of the announcements. So is it better? Is technology able to compensate a bit more now, or are there still a lot of barriers that technology just can't overcome yet?
Yeah, I think, and just on your point about on the bus, they might not think you're disabled. 1 in 3 people in the UK have some form of hearing loss or deafness.
Really?
So, yeah, so statistically, we just don't have hearing tests as well. So we don't find out about it. And the more people start to have hearing tests, the more we're discovering there are way more deaf people than we originally knew. And even the World Health Organization has predicted that and hearing loss is going to be one of the biggest conditions in the world, one of the top 3, because also of sound pollution, headphones and things like that. So
I have some hearing loss actually, because I am good, so I actually do go and get my eyes and ears tested once every 2 years. It's a reoccurring
well done. People do the
calendar invite on my
eyes,
phone.
but not always the ears.
No, I do it. So, but they really freaked me out actually. The first time I had my hearing test, they were like, "There's some hearing loss in one of your ears, but not in the other," which is really odd. And that's like, you know, sometimes that could be about brain damage. And I was like, "Oh my god, what?"
Yeah.
And so I had it tested a few times. That they don't think I've got brain damage, although maybe the jury's out. But there is in one of my ears that, like, I can't remember if it's the higher or lower. Like, I can't hear it as well.
Yeah.
But I think I'm fine. The only problem I struggle, I don't know if you might get this as well, but like if I'm ever in bars, and this is my pet peeve, bars that charge like £14 for a cocktail and then blast music like it's a nightclub. It's like I can't ever. So whenever I'm like speaking to someone, especially if I want to act cool and laid back and stuff, I can't. I have to like kind of like lean. What are they saying to me?
Yeah, so if you're leaning forward, you're lip reading without realizing.
Oh.
So you leant forward and like squinted, and that is lip reading, right? Because
Oh god.
and also it's extra hard in bars because there's background music, there's people talking. So background noise, especially if you're maybe not profoundly deaf, but have some like mild or moderate hearing loss and deafness, background noise can be particularly difficult. So that's when I find it really difficult. So I'm lip reading constantly, right? And if you're in a dark bar, it's harder to lip read. And if you're in a busy bar and people aren't facing you, it's harder to lip read. And so even things like that, when we're looking at like the architecture and the layout of a room, you know, so bars with like high ceilings, that industrial look, sound bounces around. Whereas bars with soft furnishings, curtains, cushions, sectioned off areas, they absorb the sound better. So it actually gets rid of a lot of that background noise. So they might be playing their music at the same volume as another bar, but it's absorbing more of it. Then also like the lighting in bars and where the bar is and where you can sit and can you see each other across the table. And if you go to a wedding and there's a big centerpiece in the middle, obviously you can't lip read across and you can't sign across either. So, you know, you're just like, well, I'm not going to meet those people on the other side of the table. But yeah, I think it's, you know, it is a big thing. It's 1 in 3, and it's not something that people know about. I think technology has made things a lot better in the way of hearing aids, because, you know, back in the day there were ear trumpets where you'd actually hold a trumpet like Victorian era, and there'd be battery powered hearing aids that you'd hide in your hair or the furniture because they were so big, right? So obviously they've got a lot better than that, and my hearing aids stream music, and, you know, I can watch Instagram videos on my phone and it goes straight into my ears. I can answer my phone on through my hearing aids. But also, you know, new technology is coming about and people aren't considering disability and access. And that's not just technology, that's across the board. And also it's awareness, right? So you said that you got a hearing test, they said you had some loss on one side and that was quite rare, and you could have a brain tumour is normally the... And brain tumours are quite rare, but they happen. Some of them are benign and they just sit there and they're just monitored. I have one-sided, well, it's not completely one-sided. So I have deafness in both ears. It's worse on one side. So initially I got one hearing aid, and initially they said to me, oh, you know, you need to get your brain scanned, which is a scary thing. And that, you know, I feel like they could have coached it a bit better and like broken it to me a bit better. So then I was panicking, and I have anxiety anyway, and I went for an MRI and everything's fine. But you know, the waiting list for an MRI is also like weeks. So the whole time I'm panicking of like, oh my God, what does this mean? So yeah.
Writing your will, putting little stickers on your things.
Yeah, like, oh my gosh, what's this? Who's this ring going to go to? Because I really like this one. So
I've had that before.
Yeah.
You're looking at your furniture thinking, who shall I let have it?
Also, you have to take your bra off for an MRI if it's got underwiring, which seems quite intimate. I was getting divorced at the time. I was like, was I getting divorced at that time? I don't know. I was about to get divorced, and I was like, wow, the MRI is getting to like third base or whatever it is, and no one else is.
God. Talk to me a little bit about your presenting career, because I think that maybe a lot of people that have a disability maybe subconsciously sort of rule themselves out from being able to do certain careers. I know that for me especially, I never thought I'd be on TV because I have dyslexia. So I was like, well, I'll never be able to read naughty cues. That's not something I can do, but the world is changing and I get on TV enough. But you do a lot of presenting, a lot for the BBC as well. So tell me a little bit about how you got into that and how, you know, you found that as someone with a disability.
Yeah, so I started out in stand-up. So I did stand-up comedy for 7 years. I did a couple of Edinburgh Fringes. I did a UK tour. And it was actually at a gig that was the first time I realised I couldn't hear someone. Up until then, I had no idea that I was deaf. I think I've, you know, had some form of deafness since probably primary school, because I used to sit in the front to lip read the teacher, but I didn't realise that's what it was at the time. But I was at a gig and the person running the gig was talking to me and another comedian over this background noise. And I was like, well, they're muttering. I can't understand anything they're saying. Whereas the other comedian heard exactly what they said. And that was the first time I remember going, wow, I didn't hear something very clearly that someone else did. But I was in that stand-up world. I started talking about my experience, and I think stand-up is just brilliant, and it's a great training ground for getting used to being yourself on stage and talking. And essentially stand-up is presenting, but it's presenting jokes, right? So, and you have to get your personality across. You have to present things in the right way where the audience feel comfortable and like they can trust you. And so I think stand-up was a great kind of area, because my acting, you know, I'm an actress as well. My training originally was in acting. So I was good at being other people, but I had to learn to be myself before I could be a presenter. So stand-up really...
That's a good tip.
Yeah, stand-up really taught me that. And also having to like write material about my life and what do I want to say and how do I want to express myself. And so I think even if, you know, people don't end up being on Live at the Apollo, stand-up is a really great kind of training ground for like learning all those things, and it's definitely worth kind of giving it a go, and it's super fun. The reason I stopped doing stand-up, and I still do love it, is because, you know, I was deaf, I had hearing aids. I had only one at the time, I have two now. Double trouble. I stopped because it was such a loud environment. So, you know, we talk about all that background noise in bars. Every time I was travelling all across the country on public transport to get to these gigs. So I was constantly missing things, having to concentrate, you know, and it's a stressful environment when you're like, am I hearing everything? Do I have all the information for this journey? Am I going to end up in the wrong place? And then when I got to these gigs, you know, you arrive and there's a bar and there's a crowd milling around, and in the green room there's comedians talking, and it was all that sort of really noisy environment that I'm then concentrating and lip reading in. When I was on stage, it was dreamy because everyone has to be quiet mostly, and there's a spotlight on you and you have a microphone, so you're louder than everyone else. So that was great. But yeah, it was all the stuff around it. And there's something with deafness called concentration fatigue, because you're trying so hard to hear and you're trying to lip read, and that takes a lot of concentration, that you get just absolutely exhausted from doing it. And I found that stand up and that environment was making me exhausted for the rest of the things I do. And as you know, I do lots of things because I have ADHD, and also I enjoy them. So I had to stop doing stand-up comedy, but I still loved this kind of avenue of me being myself as well as being an actor. And so I guess that sort of led into presenting. So I had a radio show on Hoxton Radio every week, which, is like a local community station, but it really gives you a training ground for like everything radio. I started my own podcast. I've had many podcasts over the years. And then I was, doing bits and bobs, presenting live events, hosting live events. And that experience, I think, eventually led me to being on the telly.
I love that. And how do you find being on the TV? Like, are there any accessibility issues there, or is everything pretty catered for?
Yeah, I mean, there's a new role which is incredible, and a lot of people don't know about it in TV, as an access coordinator. So this is like a fairly new, there wasn't really training even for it, or like a professional qualification for it like 10 years ago. So it's quite a new kind of role in the industry. And luckily, at the BBC, like on the One show, they have an access coordinator role. So there is someone who's kind of being an advocate for you, so you don't have to constantly tell everyone all of your access needs, because that can get really tiring too. And, you just want to do the thing, which is like presenting the piece about the fun story that you've discovered. Because I have a journalism background as well, I like to pitch my own pieces. I like to care about the stuff I'm presenting about. So, I care about the story and what we're going to do, rather than, telling new people, or I have hearing aids and I lip read, and if you could face me when you're talking, and if there's a lot of people I'm talking to, that might be difficult, so I might need a lip speaker. So a lip speaker is like a BSL interpreter, but for someone who's not fluent in BSL, so they might use some signs, but they repeat what people have said. They repeat it in a really clear lip pattern, so I can easily lip read them in case someone's turning away and I missed something. So an access coordinator is amazing, but it's still a fairly new role, especially even in TV, and even in big budget TV. So, if anyone else is looking to get into TV, has their first few jobs or whatever, always ask for an access coordinator.
Okay. And also being in front of the camera a lot, some people would call you inspiring. I call you inspiring.
Thanks.
But I just wanted to ask, is that a little bit patronising nowadays, that calling everyone that's disabled, that is able to do something, inspiring? Or should it be actually, no, but it is. It's harder for them to get there. Where do you kind of stand on the inspiring word?
Yeah, so there's a thing called like inspiration porn, which is like, people taking disabled people's stories and then being like, aren't they so inspiring for just being out of the house and being disabled? And that's really frustrating and a negative thing to do, because it's like, no, of course we're out of the house. Like, we're people, we're like living our lives. And I think, with politics at the moment as well, these disability cuts that have been proposed are going to throw so many disabled people into poverty, or further into poverty, and really, really affect people's lives. And I'm part of a campaign called Taking the PIP, because PIP is the disability benefit. It has nothing to do with work.
That's actually my next question. So just for people, especially that might not even be in the UK, can you just explain what exactly has happened with the cuts, and then what you guys are doing about it?
Yes, disability benefits in the UK is a rigorous system, right? So I think if you're not disabled, if you're a non-disabled person, a lot of people talk about, scroungers that are getting benefits and they don't really deserve them, and benefit fraud, right? And last year, the government actually did an assessment, and with disabled benefit fraud, the results were 0. And that allows for admin errors as well. So getting a disability benefit in the UK is a very difficult process. So I have a disabled child, as well as myself being disabled. So even filling out the form for a disabled child is like, it takes hours. It took me weeks because it felt traumatic to do. You have to fill out in so much detail. You have to get letters from like medical care providers, the medical teams who are overseeing all of them, as well as you writing down your day-to-day life, like with your child. And it's the same as an individual applying for like a PIP payment, which is what this benefit is called. So there's access to work, which is a benefit for disabled people. I mean, it's called a benefit, but I think it should be renamed access. So it's literally bridging the gap. So society is not accessible, right? And it's been designed to be not accessible. People have invented things and designed systems and they're not accessible. So this benefit bridges the gap to make it accessible for disabled people. So it's not like disabled people are like sitting at home living off benefits because there's not enough money coming from benefits to live off them. It's bridging the gap. So access to work is bridging the gap in the workplace, and the PIP benefit is bridging the gap in day-to-day life. So like for a disabled person who wants to get a bus to work, there might not be an accessible bus stop. I'm not even talking about like a ramp onto the bus. I'm talking about getting to the bus stop because there's no drop curbs if they're in a wheelchair, for example. So then they have to go all the way 2 streets away, come back on themselves where there's a drop curb. So it takes them like 4 times the amount of time to actually get to the bus stop before they're even on the bus. So it's stuff like that that bridges the gap. So the government have announced proposed cuts. This would be the biggest disability benefit cut on record ever in the UK, and it would affect thousands of disabled people's lives. And whereas before it's like a system, so they score you in a system. So now with this new proposed system, say if you're disabled and unable to feed yourself, you wouldn't score high enough to get the benefit if you can not feed yourself, and that was the only thing. So you wouldn't get any help. So it's wild. Like this new system is wild. You have to score in all these different categories to then be eligible, and it just doesn't make sense. You know, Scope, the charity, have done kind of evaluations and surveys, and disabled people are often down to over £2,000 a month just from the costs of being disabled. You know, and me with hearing aids, people often say like, I'm not disabled enough or I'm not deaf enough, because they expect a deaf person to only, you know, use British Sign Language as their first language and be profoundly deaf and not wear hearing aids. Yes, that is some deaf people's experience, but there's a whole range of experience. But, you know, I charge my hearing aids overnight, so I pay for the electricity to charge them. You can get hearing aids on the NHS, but they might not be as up to date as in the private sector. So one pair of hearing aids in the private sector is £3,000, sometimes more.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then also like the everyday, like if I need a lip speaker because I'm at an event where there's going to be loads of people and I'm not going to be able to lip read everyone, if I don't get the access to work payment for the lip speaker, I have to pay for the lip speaker myself, because a lot of workplaces don't even know about it or won't cover it. You know, travel, I get a disabled person's rail card, which is a third off travel, because there isn't the access there. But it's still a really stressful experience traveling, especially if it's someone new, stations that you don't know the tricks of like how to find out, you know, what that announcement said. And so all of that is kind of extra on top of just living your life. And a lot of people don't realise that, even with, you know, deaf people, even with people with hearing aids. You know, I lip read all day. That is really tiring if I'm out and about all day in a really loud background noise. And I'm so exhausted the next day that I can't work a normal schedule. Normal in inverted commas. So, you know, there's no benefit really given for that. There's only benefit given for actual kind of access and clear-cut things. So I'm missing out on work because I'm deaf and I have to lip read because I'm exhausted the next day. So I can only work one day and take a rest the next day. And people with kind of chronic disability, chronic pain, chronic illnesses have a lot of that too. And I think as a society, we just don't know about that. We don't educate ourselves, and the awareness isn't there. Sorry, I went off on a rant, but there you go.
No, that's all good. So when does this all come into effect from?
So the cuts are proposed cuts, and I'm part of this campaign called Taking the PIP to try and stop those cuts from happening, or to try and get them to reevaluate them. So we don't know whether they're sort of like definitely confirmed yet, and then it would start to play out across the next couple of years. But there's no sort of set it would come into effect on this date yet, because obviously there's a lot of campaigning around stopping it.
That's so wild that is even something that this government, I think this government, I mean, I'm going to try and be very politically neutral on this podcast, but this government just seems out to just make enemies of everyone. I was going to ask you, actually, from an ally perspective, what can people do to help and support with this benefit cuts, but also just in the wider context of being more aware of people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think educating yourself is super important. So, like, the responsibility is quite often on the disabled person to, like, come to the place, educate everyone on their needs and how that they can put access in place. And actually, if people just do some basic education themselves of, like, oh, I know there's someone in my office who uses a wheelchair. I know there's someone in my office who's neurodivergent. I know there's someone who's deaf. I mean, and there's likely to be, right? Even if it's not a visible disability, a hidden disability, statistics say. So if you do a bit of research and, like, if you're having a meeting with a deaf person or someone who uses hearing aids, someone who lip reads, if you're going out of the office, even just like picking a cafe that isn't super loud, or like booking a table for lunch that isn't near the coffee machine in the kitchen, which has an open thing, so there's loads of background noise. Or, if you're doing a presentation, sending it in advance so someone who's neurodivergent can read it and sort of prepare, so that when they're in the presentation they can be present and listen without trying to kind of gather all that information. It's, with dyslexia and everything, if you have time or you get the materials before and after. In friendships, like, it's so nice when my friends think about what things are going to be like for me. So yeah, if we're going out, like, this environment might be really loud for Sam, so she might need a bit of quiet time afterwards, or a quiet space nearby. Maybe I can Google, if we're going to a festival in a park, maybe I can Google a nice quiet cafe nearby where we can go so she can have a bit of respite, so that I don't always have to do the work, and disabled people don't always have to do the work. And then with the campaign, you can follow Taking the PIP, PIP, on Instagram and just share everything they're doing, basically, to help raise awareness. You can also write to your GP, I was going to say MP. You can write to your MP. You can write to your GP too if you want, but writing to your MP would be useful, and to ask them to stand up for stopping these benefit cuts, and also just trying to raise awareness and listen to disabled people and share their content and their views.
Just before we move on from this topic, just one final question on that. I just wanted to get your understanding, like, finger in the air, finger on the pulse. How is the general public's reaction to people that are disabled? Because I feel like on the one hand, people are more understanding and aware of things than ever. But as you're saying, with this PIP benefit, the margin of fraud in it is so small. But then obviously we have the papers that's like, look at this man that claimed to be in a wheelchair. We've caught him breakdancing on his trip that we've paid for in Spain. The scum, cut it all. And so you get these kind of like wild, once in a year kind of, he was obviously gaming the system, but that's one person out of millions. Are the public aware of that, or has that kind of built up this kind of like, disabled? Where are you on that?
Yeah, I think we think we're more aware than ever, but also we're super obviously influenced by the media, and it is a scary time right now, especially with the trans community, who I've so much kind of love for, and I believe that obviously trans people are people and they deserve all the rights that come with that. And I do not agree with the Supreme Court decision and everything that's come in the wake of that. I think we're becoming less kind to each other. And yeah, there are these one stories of, once someone posed as a man and went into as a trans man and went in a trans woman and went into a women's loos. And that is one person in a whole community of people who I've met, and everyone I've met is loving and kind and gorgeous and would never do that, So it's like one baddie doesn't tarnish everyone. And it's the same with people. There are terrible people in the world, but not all people are terrible because there are terrible people in the world. Actually, sometimes having one terrible person brings out so much good in so many other people. And I think that's what's going on with so many communities, especially, the disabled community, the trans community, our community, the LGBTQ bi community, queer community. And people aren't seeing the full story because the full story isn't being reported or told to them. So I think we need to search out the full story ourselves.
Yeah. Well, speaking of telling our own stories, I did want to move this conversation a little bit to talk about podcasting, because you have a load of podcasts. We've already talked a little bit about the podcasts we do together. I wanted to just understand from you, what made you get into podcasting specifically? Like, obviously it's something that I love, but what made you sort of pick up that mic for the first time?
Yeah, I got involved quite early on in podcasts. What a humble brag. But I was doing a radio show on Hoxton Radio, and then I thought, oh, this could be a podcast. I'll cut out the music. And I was having really interesting chats with comedians. It was called Baines Plus One. And, it wasn't created to be a podcast because it's a radio show and I just cut out the music. But that was my first foray into podcasts. And I think it's a really lovely world and lovely community. And it gives you the freedom to do things that you couldn't necessarily do in mainstream channels, have interesting conversations. And, like we said, the things that are reported in the media, we can report the real story or the more expanded story in things like podcasts, or just have like beautiful conversations. So my podcast that I set up called The Divorce Social. The reason I set up that podcast is because I was getting divorced and I didn't know anyone my age. I was like in my 30s, in my early 30s at the time. I'm still in my 30s now, in fact, but late 30s. I was in my early 30s and I didn't know anyone else my age getting divorced. And I literally just wanted to talk to people about it. And a podcast was a great excuse to be like, please talk to me about your divorce. It's a podcast, so it's a legit thing. And lots of people told me no one would listen to that and it would be all bitter and horrible, and so why would anyone want to listen or talk about it? And it's actually this really like joyous community. It's been going for years now. We've won awards, which is nice, but and we have a laugh, and we talk about hard times, but it's real life, and it's a community that I didn't have and I couldn't find when I was getting divorced. And people like message me about that podcast and say like it saved their life in a time where they felt so alone and didn't know what to do. And like, wow, look at the power of podcasts.
It's so interesting, isn't it, as a medium? Because you're totally right. And I love that you're like, because I think everyone thinks podcasting, it's about, we've got to get the big views, but it's not always about that. Like, I love that you're like, I just want to speak to some other divorced people. And I think that that's where some of the best ideas come from. And you're totally right. If you had had to kind of get this on mainstream media, you'd have to do test audiences and pitch it and get everyone else involved. But the fact that you're able to just pick up a microphone and do it yourself is what makes it more authentic and makes it resonate with people, I think. It's why I love the medium of podcasting. But tell me then, so obviously your podcast, what have you learned about yourself after kind of going through a divorce? I think so many people see a divorce as negative. It's an ending thing, it's a failure maybe, but actually it's a beginning. So I'm interested to know what you kind of learn about yourself from going through that.
Oh my God, so much. And I learn everything from every person I talk to. And still now, I'm years on from my divorce, but I'm still a divorced person. Because I remember people saying to me, oh, you'll only have an audience for that period while they're going through the divorce, but you're still that's still a life experience of yours ongoing. I might get divorced again. I don't know if I'll get married again, to be honest. But so I've learned so much, and also I've been through so much in my life. I started that podcast, I was getting divorced. I was in a show called Magic Mike Live at the time. Sure, I was just come out as bisexual. I had my first proper relationship with a woman, and now fast forward, I'm with another man, but he's a nice one, had a baby, don't want to get married again, very happy in the way I am. And so it's really interesting It's really interesting because I was like, am I going to lose my audience now I'm in another relationship and I've had a baby? But I think it's actually just, it's nice of the journey. And when I talk to my guests, it's nice to hear their journey, you know, whether they're like in it now or it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think I've learned that life goes on, that divorce isn't, it feels so raw when you're in it and it's so like all encompassing. But it's
what's the run up like up to a divorce? Like how, like, is there this horrible period between sort of the fun of being married and then kind of realizing this isn't working, then pretending it is working, then try to make it work until that divorce? Like, I guess everyone's story is different, but what's it like emotionally to kind of go through that realization that this is not going to work?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, obviously it's different for a lot of people. For some people, it's a complete shock and they had no idea. So, you know, the rug's pulled out from under them. For other people, you know, and my experience, it's sort of like, oh, it's daily life. And you sort of accept that this is the way things are, but the way things are isn't that nice. But that's, you sort of tell yourself, well, this is just life though, you know. I'm not going to be happy all the time. But then you realise that you're not happy for most of the time. And it's more of it's a bit like deafness, you know. Unless you go deaf overnight, you're not really like one day hearing, one day deaf. You know, it was gradual for me. You know, some people do like get an infection and then become deaf or something, or are born deaf, you know. But for me, I think possibly my deafness was gradual, or I was born with it and then it got worse. So it's that thing of you don't quite realise until you realise. And I think it's the same with divorce. You know, you don't quite realise, you convince yourself this is life, it's sort of fine, things will get better, or just stay the same, but that's fine. And then one day it's not fine anymore, and you look back and think, oh, it's been really not fine. In fact, possibly quite horrible for quite a long time. And don't I deserve to be happy? But I think the I deserve to be happy doesn't come for a while, till after your divorce.
What from a lot of the people you've been speaking to, so I have had an advice columnist on the podcast recently, and we were talking about the cost of living, and that a lot of couples now cannot afford to separate. Like, the cost of living is so bad, particularly ones that have got children. And she's talking about, you know, people do bird nesting now, which is where the kids stay in the family home and they rent a sort of one bed close by, and they sort of alternate, so they're not living under the same roof, but they can't afford to have two family homes like people would have before. Have you, in your conversation, seen anything where the cost of living is basically meaning people just can't afford to divorce?
Yeah, it's a massive worry. And the nesting thing started in the US and it's come over to the UK much more now. And it means that there's like, so you have the family home and then you have like a separate flat. And sometimes the separate flat is even shared by the parents, but they just stay there one at a time if there really isn't much money. Yeah, that's
the idea. Yeah, they flip over, right?
Yeah, or the parents have their own separate flat. So there's two separate flats and then the family home that they come into. Yeah, it's a massive thing. And I've spoken to sort of financial experts and stuff on the podcast about it. And especially, you know, if one of you hasn't been working as much as the other one because you've been looking after children, because you've been doing house renovations, you know, whatever it is, and you were relying on their income, then all of a sudden to look at supporting yourself and the children on your own, or just yourself. You know, I didn't have kids when I got divorced, and just looking at, you know, can I afford everything myself? And I stayed in our house and I bought him out, and I was like, can I actually afford this house? And so, you know, you're so caught up in the emotion of divorce because it's such an emotional thing, but you do have to think about the financials. And, you know, we do talk about on the podcast, like, if you are thinking about it as a possibility, like, do a little spreadsheet, which sounds so clinical, but it's like, you do need to prepare for the future. Like, would you be able financially to get divorced if you can't do that now, but it's something that, you know, you want to do and you think it will make you happier in the future? What can you do to get everything ready for that? You know, is there a pot of savings? Is there places that you're looking for where you can afford? You know, is it a conversation with your current partner of like, this is what I want to do in the future, but we don't have the money? You know, if it's amicable and everything. There's all, I would say that there's usually a point where it's not amicable, even in the most amicable ones. But you can find a nice point again afterwards. And I think that gives a lot of people hope as well. Like, a lot of people would say they hate their ex when they're going through the divorce, and then they end up really good friends years later.
Yeah, I've heard of this, that people, can kind of get to a point where it's like, look, it didn't work out between us, but I don't wish you any ill.
Yeah, I've even had people going on holiday with their new partner, their ex, and their new partner and the kids, and staying in like one house, which to me at the time was wild. But, if it works, great.
So if there is anyone listening to this that is going through a divorce, what would you tell them outside of listening to your podcast?
Listen to my podcast that's had 500,000 downloads. You're going to be okay is the biggest thing. You're going to be okay. Ask people for help. It's one of the hardest things you'll go through, and anyone will go through. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to use support around you. And there is a community of us. There are people who've been through it and are thriving now. And that can and will be you. But you have to go through the Can I swear on your podcast?
I'll bleep you out. I don't want to get algorithmed. But you can swear.
You have to go through the stuff first. Time, so annoying, but also look after yourself. Like, what are the things that you can do for you? If you're like moving into a new place, or you're in the house and there's memories everywhere, paint the kitchen pink like I did. Get rid of that armchair, put wallpaper up in a frame on the wall to just change your environment. There are really, cheap things that you can do. Make yourself a face mask out of some yogurt in the fridge and a bit of mint or something. Maybe not mint, because that can be bad for your skin. There are, even if you're like in dire straits financially, look after yourself, go and sit outside, ask for help. It's going to be okay.
Sam, this has been an absolutely brilliant conversation. We haven't even got to half the things I wanted to ask you, so you're definitely going to have to come back for a part 2 at some point. If people do want to know more about you, where would you like to send them? Go on, read off all your many podcasts and all your other projects.
I have a website, samanthabaines.com, where all the things are. I have podcasts, The Divorce Social. I have family podcast called Silly News. We co-host Bisexual Brunch with Ash. I've just started a new stationery company, which I'm really excited about, which is pressed flowers designed into patterns on notebooks and journals, because that really helps my mental health. And studies show just looking at flowers can improve your mood. So that's called Baines London. So you can get it on Etsy and on Instagram as well. And then, follow me on Instagram and TikTok and all the things. That's Samantha Baines.
How enterprising. I love this, that you've got so many projects going on.
I'm a businesswoman.
Yeah, there we go. Right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.